My dear friend, welcome. I see you've come seeking solace, a soft place for your restless mind to land. The day has been a cacophony of demands and digital chimes, a relentless parade of things that must be done. Thoughts that must be thought. Your body is here, nestled in its sanctuary of blankets. But your mind, your mind, is still whirring, a clockwork mouse on a wooden floor, spinning its wheels, going nowhere but making a terrible racket as it does. Come, let us quiet that mouse. Let us oil its gears with the thick, golden syrup of a different kind of attention. You do not need to be captivated. You do not need to be thrilled. You need not even be mildly interested. In fact, let us make a pact, you and I. Let us seek out the profoundly uninteresting, the terminally trivial, the historical equivalent of watching paint dry, but paint that dried 400 years ago, in a shade of beige that was considered mildly controversial in its time. For there is a profound magic in the mundane, a deep peace in the pointless. To be fascinated is to be tense, leaning forward, eager for the next twist, but to be gently, softly bored. That is a state of profound relaxation. It is the mental equivalent of sinking into a warm bath where the water is the exact same temperature as your skin, so you cannot feel where you end and the stillness begins. So, give me your buzzing thoughts, hand over that mental checklist, place the weight of your unfinished conversations here, beside us. They will be safe. They are not going anywhere. But for now, we are going somewhere else. We are going on a journey into the velvet depths of gentle, tedious history. Not the history of kings and battles, of revolutions and revelations. No, we are going to wander through the forgotten annexes, the dusty storerooms, the administrative basements of the past. We will concern ourselves with the things that were too ordinary for anyone to bother remembering with any passion. Imagine, if you will, a vast, gray, softly carpeted room. It is silent, save for the distant, rhythmic click of a clock. The walls are lined with filing cabinets, not of steel, but of aged oak, with brass pulls that have gone slightly dull. Each drawer is labeled, not with words like love or war or glory, but with phrases like mid-14th century European hinge design variations, or regulatory adjustments to saffron trade duties in the Hanseatic League. 1387. This is our library. This is our playground. Our story will begin, as all truly boring things should, in the middle. Not at the beginning of something exciting, but in the long, languid afternoon of a very stable period. We will choose a place of no particular strategic importance, perhaps a modest ecclesiastical principality in the Holy Roman Empire, a place where the most significant export was a moderately durable type of liturgical candle wax. And we will focus on a person of no great rank, a minor functionary, a sub-clerk in the office of the deputy exchequer of the bishop's see. His name might be something like Gottfried. Not young, not old, possessed of a decent, clear hand for penmanship, but prone to a slight recurring stiffness in his right wrist when the weather turns damp. Our tale will not be about Gottfried uncovering a plot, or falling in love, or achieving a great ambition. It will be about his primary task for the autumn of 1374, the comprehensive audit and recataloguing of the Grange tithe receipts from the northern parishes. This involves parchment, a great deal of parchment. Some of it is foxed with brown spots. The ink on some of the older scrolls has faded to a rusty brown, and Gottfried must squint in the light of a tallow dip to distinguish between a V and a Th. He must cross-reference the reported bushels of rye, barley, and millet with the official schedules of valuation from the 1352 synod, while accounting for the temporary abatement granted after the hailstorm of 1361, an event recorded in a separate water-damaged ledger that smells faintly of cellar. Can you feel it? The glorious, enveloping tedium of it, the sheer weight of insignificant detail. Let your mind try to hold on to the image of Gottfried's quill, a goose feather, its nib worn to a specific, comfortable angle. See a pot of ink, a sooty black. Hear the scratch, a soft, persistent whisper against the vellum. A scratch, a pause. Gottfried looks up, not in inspiration, but because he is considering whether to sharpen his quill now, or after he completes the entry for the parish of St. Ethelfrith in the Marsh. He decides to do it now. He takes his small personal penknife, its handle smooth from use. The shick-shick sound as he trims the nib is precise, minor, and deeply unimportant. This is our rhythm. This is our lullaby. We will linger on the inventory. Not just 10 bushels of barley, but the quality of the barley. The 1372 harvest was considered of middling quality, due to a cooler summer, resulting in a grain that was slightly less plump, and thus, according to the supplemental guidelines on volumetric measurement compiled by the now-deceased clerk Ambrosius, subject to a compensatory adjustment factor of 0.94, when converting to the standard Würzburg bushel for taxation purposes. Gottfried must calculate this. He does so slowly, on wax tablet, the stylus making faint grooves. He checks his calculation. He finds an error in the third step. He had carried a 2 instead of a 1. He corrects it. The new total is 3/5 of a bushel less than the original submission from the parish priest, a Father Ignatius, who is known for his optimistic, if mathematically suspect, annual returns. Gottfried makes a neat marginal note in a clear, minuscule script. Discrepancy. 0.6 bushels, standard measure. Refer to supplementary folio gamma for 1372. Seasonal ache. He feels a small, quiet sense of professional satisfaction. The world has not changed. No wars have been averted. No famines solved. But a record is now accurate. The universe of the bishop's finances is, in one infinitesimally small corner, more orderly. We will follow him as he takes his midday repast, a thick slice of rye bread, some hard cheese, a small onion. He eats in the scriptorium, at his desk, careful not to crumb the parchment. He washes it down with small beer, slightly sour. He gazes out of the narrow window. The sky is the color of a wood pigeon's breast, a soft, uniform gray. A single rook flaps lazily from one gable to another. Gottfried wonders, idly, if it is the same rook he sees every day. He cannot tell one rook from another. He finishes his onion. The afternoon brings a different, but related, task. The vellum for the new fair copy of the Consolidated Tithe Report must be prepared. This involves pumice stone to smooth the surface and a dusting of fine chalk to improve the ink's hold. Gottfried performs this work with a methodical, unhurried pace. Each stroke of the pumice is even, circular. The whisper of stone on skin is a dry, soothing sound. The chalk dust rises in a little cloud, caught in a slant of gray light from the window, before settling. His world, in this moment, is this rectangle of treated animal skin. The feel of the abrasive, the goal of a perfectly receptive writing surface. It is a meditation in 3 acts. Scour, dust, buff. Perhaps a colleague, another clerk named Reinhardt, stops by his desk. They do not discuss politics or art or philosophy. Reinhardt complains at some length about a persistent draft in his own cubicle. A draft that seems to come from a specific crack in the mortar near the floor. A crack he has tried to stuff with a mixture of linen scraps and beeswax, to limited effect. Gottfried offers a sympathetic nod and suggests perhaps mixing a little clay with the beeswax for better adhesion. Reinhardt considers this, finds it sensible, and the conversation lapses into a comfortable silence, punctuated only by the distant sound of a bell, tolling none. This is the fabric of our story. a fabric woven from threads of administrative procedure, minor bodily discomforts, the weather, and the meticulous management of agricultural surplus. We will follow Gottfried home through the muddy lanes of the town. We will note the puddles, the way he steps carefully to avoid the worst of the muck. We will hear the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, not as a heroic rhythm, but as a distant, repetitive clang. Clang, pause, clang that has been going on all afternoon and will likely continue until dusk. We will see the glow of hearth fires through shutters, smell the smoke of burning peat, a homely, dull smell. At home, there is a simple pottage, simmered by his sister. It contains barley, leeks, and a piece of salted pork fat for flavor. They eat in quiet companionship. The fire crackles. The pottage is hot, salty, and uniformly beige. It is exactly as it was yesterday, and will be tomorrow. After the meal, Gottfried might mend a leather strap on his satchel, using an awl and some waxed thread. The task requires focus, but of a shallow, repetitive kind. Pulling of the thread through the punched holes, the tightening of the stitch, the knot at the end. Then to bed, on a straw-filled mattress. He lies there, listening to the settling sounds of the house, the scurrying of a mouse in the wattle, the sigh of the wind under the eaves. His mind is not racing. It is pleasantly empty, filled only with the residual, unremarkable impressions of the day. The feel of parchment, the taste of onion, the smell of chalk dust. He sleeps, and as Gottfried sleeps, his world, a world of minor audits, slight drafts, and satisfactory pottage, dissolves into yours. The scratch of his quill becomes the whisper of your own breathing. The gray, pigeon-breast sky outside his window becomes the gentle darkness behind your eyelids. The profound, encompassing peace of a life concerned only with the small, manageable, deeply boring tasks of existence. That peace is yours for the taking. For the next many hours, we will stay here, in this meticulously uneventful pocket of the 14th century. We will explore, in numbing detail, the process of making the ink Gottfried uses. We will consider the life of the goose that donated the quill, not in a sentimental way, but in terms of its diet and its effect on the feather's stiffness. We will examine the bureaucratic dispute between two neighboring parishes over the precise boundary of a water meadow, a dispute that generated 17 scrolls of testimony over 40 years and was ultimately resolved by a compromise involving the annual gifting of 6 geese. We will dive into the thrilling history of medieval ledger-keeping conventions, the shift from Roman numerals to more complex systems, and the debate over the use of red ink for debit entries. We will wander without urgency through the grain markets, noting the price differential between oats grown on south-facing slopes and those from north-facing fields. We will sit in on a meeting of the town council concerning the upkeep of the main well, a meeting featuring long digressions about the sourcing of reliable rope and the moral character of the current well winch minder. There will be no peril, no climax, only the gentle, ceaseless secretion of inconsequential facts, the soothing hum of a machine that produces nothing but its own smooth operation. Your mind, desperate for a hook to hang its anxiety upon, will find none here. It will grasp for a moment, for a conflict, for a point, and find only the description of a 3-day synod to standardize the length of a standard candle for tax purposes, a discussion plagued by disagreements over air currents and wax density. Frustrated, your conscious mind will eventually surrender. It will let go. It will decide that if nothing of import is happening, then it, too, can stand down. The mental guards can go off duty. The watchful, anxious, planning, worrying self can finally retreat, lulled into a state of benign indifference by the relentless, river-like flow of gentle facts. The boundary between Gottfried's world and yours will blur. His minor physical sensations, the stiffness in his wrist, the warmth of the tallow dip, the solid feel of his wooden stool, will become faint echoes in your own body, encouraging it to relax, to settle, to become heavy and still. His lack of mental turmoil is a template for your own. So, let us begin properly now. Let us leave this antechamber of introduction and step fully into the gray, soft-lit scriptorium of our story. Take a last deep breath of the present, with all its sharp edges and pressing concerns. And, as you exhale, let it all go. Let us travel back, not with a bang, but with the slow, quiet turning of a heavy vellum page. It was, as established, the autumn of 1374. The weather had been unremarkable. A few weeks prior, there had been a period of light rain for 3 days, which had helped settle the dust on the roads, but had done little to replenish the wells, a topic of muted conversation among the housewives drawing water in the mornings, in the episcopal administrative complex of the See of St. Wendel. A modest establishment nestled in rolling, forested land that was neither particularly fertile nor particularly strategic. The summer's heat had finally dissipated from the stone corridors, leaving behind a cool, damp stillness that smelled of old parchment, wet wool, and the faint, ever-present scent of... In a small vaulted room on the second floor of the Chancery Wing, Gottfried, clerk of the 3rd grade, dipped his quill. The ink was a customary iron gall black, brewed in the monastery's own workshop, according to a recipe that had not changed in 70 years, a recipe involving oak galls, ferrous sulfate, gum arabic, and rainwater collected in a specific cistern north of the refectory. The consistency was good today. It flowed from the nib without blobbing, yet did not run too freely to cause feathering on the vellum. This was a small mercy, and Gottfried was aware of it in a distant, appreciative way, much as one might be aware of an absence of toothache. Before him lay the heart of his current endeavor, the Northern Parish Tithe Roll for the fiscal year 1373-74. The preliminary returns had come in from the various parish priests over the summer, scrawled on scraps of parchment, or in one case from a remote mountain chapel, on a piece of birch bark. It was Gottfried's duty to transfer these rough accounts onto the official, continuous roll of the bishopric, making the necessary calculations, applying the correct adjustments, and noting any discrepancies or anomalies for later review by the deputy exchequer, a man named Herr Berthold. The entry before him was for the village of Niederthal. The priest, an elderly man with shaky handwriting, had listed rye, 27 bushels, barley, 12 bushels, millet, 4 bushels and 1 peck, 3 geese of good weight, 4 wheels of cheese of summer making, 42 eggs delivered at Martinus. Gottfried's first task was to convert everything into a common standard of value, the silver penny. This required consulting a master schedule, a densely written table that accounted for seasonal fluctuations, estimated quality, and local transport costs. The schedule itself was a copy of a copy, its margins filled with notes and amendments from previous clerks, some of them contradicting each other. He found the entry for rye. The base price for a bushel of standard rye in a year of average yield was set at 3.5 pennies. However, a note in a different hand, dated 1368, stated, "For the northern districts, subtract a halfpenny per bushel for overland cartage to the episcopal granary at Oberstein." Another note, this one initialed by the previous deputy exchequer, read, "See ruling of 1359, inflationary adjustment after the mortality. Apply a multiplier of 1.1 to all grain base prices until further notice." Gottfried reached for his wax tablet, a wooden frame filled with a layer of beeswax, darkened with soot. He took his stylus, a pointed piece of bone. He began to calculate. 27 bushels of rye, at 3.5 pennies per bushel. That came to 94.5 pennies. He carefully incised the numerals at the 7 to 3, C. 1 tax, 8 SS. He then applied the cartage reduction of a halfpenny per bushel. That was 13.5 pennies to subtract. He scraped a line through his first total and calculated the new one, 81 pennies. Then came the inflationary multiplier of 1.1. Multiplying by 11 and then dividing by 10 was a more complex operation. He worked slowly, his tongue peeking slightly from the corner of his mouth. 81 times 11 was 891, divided by 10. That was 89 pennies and 1/10 of a penny. The system did not account for tenths of pennies in tithe assessments. They were rounded to the nearest farthing. A tenth of a penny was less than a farthing. He decided to round down. He settled on 89 pennies for the rye. He then cleared the wax tablet by holding it near the small brazier of coals at his feet, just long enough for the wax to soften, then smoothing it with the flat end of the stylus. A faint smell of warm beeswax joined the other scents in the room. He repeated the process for the barley. 12 bushels. Base price, 2 3/4 pennies, minus cartage, times the multiplier. The arithmetic was a gentle, repetitive puzzle, requiring just enough focus to occupy the surface of his mind, but not enough to stir any deeper currents of thought. It was like walking a well-trodden path through a familiar wood. You noted the trees, stepped over the roots, but your mind could wander in a peaceful, unfocused way. As he worked, the world outside the narrow window dimmed imperceptibly. The uniform gray of the sky deepened towards dusk. A servant came in quietly and lit 2 more tallow dips, placing them in iron holders on Gottfried's desk and on the desk of Reinhardt, who was working on the inventory of vestments in the cathedral sacristy, a task that involved cataloging moth damage. The new light pooled in yellow, smoky circles, making the shadows in the corners of the room longer and softer. The scratch of Reinhardt's pen was a mirror to Gottfried's own, a syncopated, whispering duet. After what might have been an hour, or perhaps 2, time in the scriptorium was measured in tasks completed, not in the movement of the sun. Gottfried reached the geese. The schedule was less clear on livestock. For poultry, a fair market value at time of delivery to be assessed by the receiving steward. A note added, if not assessed, standard value of 4 pence per goose, 3 pence per capon, 2 pence per hen. There was no record of an assessment from the steward at Oberstein for the Niederthel geese. Gottfried decided to apply the standard value. 3 geese at 4 pence each, 12 pence. He added this to the running total on the edge of his main parchment. The cheese was another matter. Wheels of cheese, summer making, of good size and not mite-ridden. The priest had written optimistically. The standard value was 6 pence per wheel. But a question arose. Was a wheel a standardized measurement? Gottfried recalled a memo from several years back, prompted by a dispute with a cheesemaker from the south who had delivered wheels no larger than a small plate. He rummaged in the oak box beneath his desk, where he kept scrolls of rulings and precedents. After unrolling 3 or 4, he found it. A decree from the bishop's chamberlain, dated 1365. Let it be known that for purposes of tithe and tariff, a standard wheel of cheese shall be of a diameter no less than the span of a man's hand from thumb-tip to the tip of his smallest finger, and of a thickness of 3 finger breadths. Gottfried considered this. He looked at his own hand, spread on the parchment. It seemed a reasonable span. There was no way of knowing if the Niederthel cheese met this standard. The priest had said of good size. Gottfried weighed the options. He could send a query to the steward at Oberstein, but that would take a week by messenger and delay the completion of the roll. He could apply a reduction, assuming the cheese was below standard, or he could take the priest at his word. After a moment's contemplation, driven more by a desire to avoid extra correspondence than by any rigorous principle, he decided to apply the full 6 pence per wheel. 4 wheels, 24 pence. He made a small, faint mark in the margin, a symbol he used to indicate a point of potential, though unlikely, future dispute. The eggs were straightforward. They were valued at 10 to the penny, unless specifically noted as being from ducks or geese, which these were not. 42 eggs were worth 4 pennies and 2/10 of a penny. He rounded down to 4 pence. He then compiled the final value for Neanderthal's tithe obligation. Rye, 89, barley. A calculated 31, knees, 12, cheese, 24D eggs, 4D 169 pence, or 1 shilling and 5 pence in the larger currency, though the roll would record it in pence. He transcribed this in his clear, formal hand onto the clean roll, adding the date and the parish name. He then carefully blotted the ink with a sprinkling of fine sand from a shaker, let it sit for a moment, and tipped the sand back into its tray. The entry was complete. 1 parish down. 17 more to go for the northern district alone. His wrist was beginning to ache, that familiar stiffness. He flexed his fingers, shaking his hand gently. He looked up. Reinhardt was rubbing his eyes. His work on moth-eaten chasubles apparently complete for the day. The room was now a cave of warm, dim light. The world beyond the windows, a wall of blackness. The draft in my corner is worse when the wind is from the east, Reinhardt said, without preamble, as if continuing a conversation from hours earlier. It finds the gap in the mortar by the floor and whistles. A thin, irritating whistle. I tried your suggestion of clay with the beeswax. It holds better, but now I have a lump of gray wax and clay on the floor. The draft now diverts around it and attacks my ankles from a different angle. Gottfried nodded, capping his inkpot. Perhaps a strip of leather nailed over the crack, a scrap from the tanners. The mortar is too crumbly to hold a nail. Reinhardt sighed, gathering his things. It is a battle of attrition I am doomed to lose. Shall we? They left the scriptorium, taking one of the tallow dips to light their way down the spiral stone staircase. The steps were worn smooth in the centers from centuries of similar clerks descending at the end of similar days. Their shadows leaped and danced grotesquely on the rough stone walls. At the bottom, a heavy oak door led out into the courtyard. The cold night air hit them, a sharp contrast to the cloistered stillness of the scriptorium. It was clear, and a vast spray of stars was visible above the black outlines of the roofs and the cathedral spire. Their breath fogged in the air. They walked in silence through the quiet streets. The town St. Wendel was asleep. Here and there, a crack of firelight showed around a shutter, or the sound of a cough came from within a house. The mud of the lane was frozen into hard ruts, which made the walking uneven. They passed the darkened front of the cooper's workshop, the smell of wet wood and hoop iron lingering. They passed the silent market square, the well-covered dark circle in the center. At the crossroads where they parted ways, Reinhardt grunted a goodnight and turned left towards the street where the lesser canons lived. Gottfried turned right, towards a narrower lane of tradesmen's houses. His home was a 2-story timber-framed building, the ground floor occupied by a quiet, elderly cobbler. Gottfried and his sister, Hildegard, lived above. He pushed the door open, entering the small, dark vestibule. The smell of tonight's pottage, cabbage this time, still hung in the air, mixed with the scent of the banked fire in the hearth. Hildegard was dozing in a chair by the embers, a piece of mending in her lap. She stirred as he entered. "There is some left in the pot," she said, her voice soft with sleep. "I ate at the hall," he said, which was partly true. He had consumed his bread and cheese there. He hung his cloak on a peg. The room was warm, the ceiling low. The firelight glinted on a single copper pot hanging on the wall, on the polished wooden bowls on the shelf. He sat on the stool opposite her, holding his hands out to the faint warmth. Hildegard resumed her slow, steady stitching. She was repairing a tear in his second tunic, a woolen one of a dun color. The needle went in and out, the thread making a soft, rhythmic shush as she pulled it through the fabric. They sat in a comfortable silence, the kind shared by people who have known each other for a lifetime and have long since run out of urgent things to say. Reinhardt still battles the draft, Gottfried said after a while. Hildegard made a non-committal sound. You should stuff the hole with rags, wool rags. They swell with the damp and seal better than wax. I will suggest it. The conversation lapsed again. The only sounds were the pop of an ember, the shush of the thread, and the distant, faint hoot of an owl somewhere beyond the town walls. Gottfried's mind, still humming faintly from the calculations of the day, slowly wound down. The numbers faded, replaced by the physical sensations of the moment. The heat of the fire on his shins, the weight of his body on the stool, the comfortable ache in his writing hand. Herr Hildegard tied off her thread and put the mending aside. They banked the fire for the night with a layer of ash. They drank a last cup of small beer, cool from the cellar. Then, by the light of a single rushlight dipped in tallow, they climbed the narrow wooden stairs to their sleeping quarters under the eaves. The room was cold. They slept on simple pallets filled with straw, under heavy woolen blankets. Gottfried lay down, the straw crackling softly beneath him. He listened to the familiar night sounds, the creak of the house timbers as they cooled, the scuttle of something in the thatch above, the slow, even sound of Hildegard's breathing from across the room. His final thoughts were not of grand designs or deep worries. They were a fleeting reflection on whether he had correctly applied the 1,1359 inflationary multiplier to the millet from Niederthel. He thought he had. He would double-check tomorrow, when the light was better. It was a small, contained thought. A pebble dropped into a deep, still pond. The ripples spread out, growing fainter and fainter, until the surface was smooth once more. And into that smooth, dark surface, Gottfried slipped into a sleep as deep and uneventful as the day that had preceded it. And you, my dear listener, are slipping with him. The details of his world, the price of rye, the problem of the draft, the consistency of the ink, are becoming your world. The slow, methodical pace of his thoughts is becoming the pace of your own. The cold of his room under the eaves is the comfortable cool of your own sheets. The distant owl is a sound in your own night. Let us stay with him through the night and into the next day. For tomorrow holds no dramatic events. Tomorrow holds only the next parish on the roll, Oberthel, and with it, a minor puzzle. The submission from Oberthel's priest is unusually precise, noting not just bushels, but fractions of bushels, measured in pecks and even pints. This will require more intricate calculation. There is also a note attached on a separate slip of parchment, mentioning that 2 of the promised 6 chickens had been taken by a fox in the week before delivery, and requesting a commensurate reduction in the assessed tithe. This will necessitate a referral to the subschedule on acts of God and vermin, allowable deductions for livestock lost prior to tithe collection. Gottfried will need to locate this subschedule. It is not in his oak box. He will have to request it from the archivist, Brother Simeon, a man of slow movements and meticulous habits, who will need to be asked just so, and who will likely engage Gottfried in a 5-minute discourse on the proper storage of vellum in damp weather before reluctantly fetching the required scroll. This is what awaits us. Not drama, but procedure. Not adventure, but administration. A deep, warm bath of bureaucracy. A lullaby of logistics. So settle in deeper. Let your breathing slow to match the slow scratch of the quill, the soft shush of the mending needle, the steady drip of condensation from the thatch into the rain barrel outside Gottfried's window. We have only just begun our journey into the soothing, sublime, and deeply boring history of a time when the most pressing concern in one man's world was the correct valuation of a partially fox-eaten chicken. The night passed over St. Wendel as a dark, silent river. In the Episcopal granary at Oberstein, 5 miles to the north, the mice were more active. They nested in the dense, dusty thatch of the roof, and their tiny, rapid feet made a constant, dry rustling sound like the stirring of dead leaves. The granary itself was a long, low building of stone and timber, smelling powerfully of grain, dust, and the faint, sweet, sour odor of fermentation from a corner where a sack of malt had gotten damp. The tithed grain from Niedertal, along with that from a dozen other villages, sat in sacks and barrels, each marked with a chalk symbol indicating the parish of origin. A single guard, an old soldier with a limp, dozed by a brazier near the main door, his spear leaning against the wall beside him. His snores were a low, bubbling counterpoint to the skittering of the mice. Nothing happened. A sack, poorly stacked, settled slightly with a soft whump, sending up a small cloud of chaff that danced in the dim air near a high, slit window. A rat, bolder than the mice, emerged from a drain hole, sniffed the air, caught the scent of the dozing man, and retreated. The guard slept on. The night grew colder. Frost began to form in delicate crystalline patterns on the iron bands of the barrels nearest the door. This was the destination of Gottfried's calculations. This silent, dusty, rodent-visited storehouse was the physical manifestation of the numbers on his roll, and it slept, as untroubled and mundane as the clerk himself. Dawn came not with a fanfare, but as a gradual lightening of the gray from charcoal to ash, and finally to the color of dirty wool. In the town, cocks crowed, their cries overlapping in a ragged, competitive chorus. Smoke began to rise from hearths as fires were rekindled. The smell of burning peat and wood smoke drifted through the lanes, mingling with the damp, earthy smell of the frost melting on the thatch. Gottfried awoke as he always did, just before the bell for prime. He lay still for a moment, listening. The scuttling in the thatch had ceased. The house timbers were silent. The cold air of the room felt sharp in his nostrils. He could see his breath. He rose, pulled on his tunic and hose, and descended the stairs to stir the embers of the hearth back to life. Hildegard was already there, breaking kindling. They worked in a wordless morning routine. She put a pot of water to heat for porridge. He went outside to the privy in the small yard at the back, his footsteps leaving dark prints in the silvered grass. The sky was a vast, pale sheet, featureless and calm. The porridge was oats, cooked with a pinch of salt. They ate it from wooden bowls, sitting by the now crackling fire. It was hot, bland, and filling. They drank weak ale. The only conversation was Hildegard remarking that the cobbler below had been coughing in the night, a deep, chesty sound. Gottfried nodded. After eating, he gathered his satchel, his pen case, a fresh lump of chalk for his tablet, and his midday bread and cheese, wrapped in a cloth. He pulled on his cloak, nodded to his sister, and stepped out into the lane. The town was waking. Shutters were being opened. A maid was emptying a chamber pot into the gutter further down the street. A boy drove two pigs, grunting and snuffling, towards the common land outside the walls. The air was full of the sounds of beginning, the thump of a loom from a weaver's shop, the rhythmic clack-clack of a fuller beating cloth in his yard near the stream, the call of a fishmonger who had come up from the river with a catch of eels. Gottfried walked through it all, a figure of routine. He nodded to the baker, who was sliding loaves from his oven on a long peel, the smell of fresh bread momentarily overpowering all else. He passed the smithy, where the fire was already blazing, though the smith was still drinking his morning ale, leaning against the doorframe. He reached the episcopal complex, passed through the gate where a bored-looking man-at-arms nodded to him, and crossed the courtyard to the chancery wing. The stone steps of the staircase were cold under his feet. Inside the scriptorium, the air was still and chill, retaining the night's cold. Reinhardt was already at his desk, blowing on his fingers. He had a new, gray lump of wax and clay by his foot, attempting to plug another suspected draft point. The leather strip idea failed, Reinhardt said gloomily, by way of greeting. The nail pulled straight out of the mortar. It's like trying to fix a sieve. Gottfried placed his satchel on his desk, arranging his ink pot, quills and knife just so. He took out the Northern Parish roll, carefully unrolling it to where he had left off. He then retrieved the rough submission from the priest of Oberthal. It was, as previously noted, unusually precise. The handwriting was a tight, angular script, the work of a man who took his record-keeping seriously. Anno Domini 1374, at the feast of St. Michael, it began. Received from the tenants of Oberthal, in full tithe as is right and proper, of rye 14 bushels, 3 pecks, and 1 pint. Of barley 8 bushels, 1 peck. Of oats 5 bushels. 2 pecks of peas, 2 bushels. Says, guys, Tamo, from the spring shearing, 12 stones weight. Of cheeses, 6 of good size and hard rind. Gottfried read through it. The fractional measurements would be tedious. The standard conversion was 2 pints to a quart, 4 quarts to a gallon, 2 gallons to a peck, 4 pecks to a bushel. Calculating the value of 14 bushels, 3 pecks, and 1 pint of rye would require converting the entire amount into the smallest unit, pints, applying the price per bushel, converted to price per pint, and then summing it. It was arithmetic of a grinding sort. He would need his wax tablet and all his concentration. But first, the fox-eaten chickens. He needed the ruling. He pushed back his stool and walked to the far end of the scriptorium, where a low arch led to the archive, a small, windowless chamber, lined with shelves and smelling strongly of mildew and dust. "You dust." Brother Simeon, the archivist, was a thin, pale man in a dusty black robe. He was carefully using a soft brush to clean the edges of a large, illuminated choir book, his movements precise and slow. "Good morrow, Brother Simeon," Gottfried said. Brother Simeon did not look up immediately. He completed a long, gentle stroke with the brush, blowing away a tiny cloud of dust before turning his head slowly. His eyes were a watery blue, magnified by the thick lenses of the spectacles perched on his nose. "Clerk, Gottfried, the damp is rising. You can smell it in the vellum. It is a perilous season for the manuscripts." "Indeed," Gottfried agreed. "I seek the subschedule on allowable deductions for livestock lost prior to collection, specifically for poultry taken by foxes." Brother Simeon blinked slowly. "Foxes. Yes, a persistent problem. The ruling. Let me see." He placed his brush down with exact care on a clean piece of linen. He turned and faced the shelves, his finger tracing along the spines of scrolls. Each was tagged with a small, inscribed wooden label. Tithes. Tithes. General ordinances. Abatements. Firmin and acts of God. That is the one. He reached up, his bony fingers closing around the scroll. He did not hand it to Gottfried immediately. Instead, he held it, looking at it thoughtfully. This copy was made in 1362. The scribe was Brother Anselm. He had a very fine hand, but he was prone to using too much gum Arabic in his ink. It has made the scroll stiff. You must unroll it with great care, lest it crack along the folds. He handed the scroll over as if it were a holy relic. "I will be most careful," Gottfried promised. "See that you are, and it must be returned before Vespers. The air in the scriptorium is too variable for such a document. The archive, for all its damp, is at least consistent." Gottfried nodded, took the scroll, and returned to his desk. He untied the linen cord with care. Brother Simeon was right. The vellum was stiff and crackled slightly as he unrolled it. The script was, indeed, beautiful. A fine, Gothic textura. It was also dense and legalistic. He found the relevant section. Item: for livestock promised and sworn in the tithe assessment, but lost prior to physical delivery into the hands of the bishop's agent, a deduction may be permitted only upon the sworn testimony of the tithe payer, corroborated by 2 other men of good standing in the parish, that the loss was due to misadventure and not to negligence or deception. There was more. For loss to common vermin, foxes, wolves, birds of prey, The deduction shall be for the full value of the lost animal, provided the carcass, or significant remains thereof, are presented as evidence. If no remains are presented, the deduction shall be limited to 1/2 the assessed value, to account for the possibility of sale or concealment. Gottfried considered this. The priest of Oberthal had not mentioned presenting fox-gnawed chicken carcasses. He had simply noted the loss. According to this, the tithe could only be reduced by 1/2 the value of the 2 chickens. He made a note on a scrap of parchment to that effect. He would need to add a query to the official roll, a standard formula. Deduction pro duibus galanes, volpe ablatis, required testimonium. He would leave it for Herr Berthold to decide if further inquiry was needed. Now, to the grain. He spent the next 2 hours immersed in conversion. 14 bushels of rye. He calculated the base value minus cartage times the multiplier for the bushels. Then he dealt with the 3 pecks. Huck was 1/4 of a bushel, so 3 pecks was 3/4 of a bushel. He calculated 3/4 of the value of a bushel of rye. Then the pint. A pint was 1/64 of a bushel. He calculated 1/64 of the bushel price. He added the 3 sums together. He did the same for the barley and the oats. The peas were straightforward, as they were reported in whole bushels. The wool was valued by the stone with a different schedule accounting for the grade. Spring wool was generally finer, and whether it had been washed or not. This wool was noted as unwashed, which meant a lower price per stone. His world shrank to the wax tablet, the stylus, the numbers, the scratch of the stylus, the occasional need to smooth the wax and start a calculation anew, the faint smell of the tallow dips, the growing stiffness in his neck from leaning over. These were the boundaries of his existence, the great events of the wider world, the ongoing papal schism, the wars between rival noble houses, the rumors of plague in distant ports were as remote and irrelevant as the surface of the moon. Here, the only schism was between a correctly and an incorrectly summed column of pence. The only war was against the creeping fatigue in his eyes. The only plague was a potential error in arithmetic, which could be quarantined and corrected with careful rechecking. Midday came. He and Reinhardt ate their bread and cheese, washed down with ale from a jug they shared. They spoke little. Reinhardt was copying a list of required repairs to the cathedral's lead roof, a catalog of leaks and corroded joints, and was complaining about the steward of works, a man who used a highly idiosyncratic system of abbreviations. He writes, FOL, Burke. Does he mean flashing broken or flange bracket? It is impossible to know. I shall have to go and look at the roof myself, I suppose. Gottfried nodded, chewing his cheese. It was a hard, salty cheese, and it required effort to eat. He was glad for the ale to wash it down. The afternoon was more of the same. He completed the Oberthal entry, making the marginal note about the chickens. He transcribed the final, meticulously calculated sum onto the main roll. The entry took up 1/3 of a column, a dense block of text and numbers, a monument to a morning's quiet labor. He then carefully re-rolled the vermin and axe of God, scroll, retied it, and returned it to Brother Simeon. The archivist inspected it for damage, gave a satisfied nod, and placed it back on its shelf. The damp is worse today, he murmured, mostly to himself. I shall have to move the choir books to the higher shelf. As Gottfried returned to his desk, the deputy exchequer, Herr Berthold, entered the scriptorium. He was a stout man with a carefully trimmed beard, dressed in a fur-trimmed robe. He carried a scent of cloves and wool grease. He moved from desk to desk, inspecting the work. He paused at Gottfried's station, leaning over to peer at the northern parish room. Oberthal, he said, his voice a low rumble. Father Godwin, a precise man, annoyingly so, but thorough. His finger, broad and with a heavy silver ring, traced down the column of numbers. He paused at the note about the chickens. Foxes. Always foxes. If I had a penny for every fox that has dined on tithe poultry, I'd be a richer man than the bishop. process it'd have value. We haven't the time to send a man to Oberthal to inspect chicken bones. But note it. Always note it. Always note it. Yes, Herr Berthold, Gottfried said. Berthold moved on to Reinhardt, grumbling about the cost of lead for the roof. At these prices, we might as thatch the house of God and be done with it. The day wound down. The light at the window faded earlier than the day before. The clouds were thickening. Gottfried completed one more small parish, Heimbach, which had a simple submission with no complications. As he sanded the final entry, the bell for Vespers began to toll, its deep bronze voice resonating through the stone of the building. He cleaned his quills, capped his ink, and put away his tools. His back ached pleasantly from hours of sitting. His mind was pleasantly empty, a clean slate wiped by hours of methodical work. Walking home, the first few flakes of snow began to fall. They were large, lazy flakes, drifting down without urgency, melting as soon as they touched the ground or the shoulders of his cloak. The town was quieting again, shutting itself in against the coming cold. Lights glowed behind shutters. The smell of cooking stews wafted from doorways. He passed a woman hurrying home with a bundle of firewood clutched to her chest. At home, Hildegard had made a thick bean and bacon soup, simmered over the fire, bubbling softly. The room was warm, steamy from the cooking pot. They ate the soup with more of the dense rye bread. It was hot, salty, and deeply satisfying. Afterward, Gottfried spent an hour repairing a broken strap on his satchel, using an awl and waxed thread, just as he had imagined the night before. The work was simple, manual, a good counterpoint to the mental calculations of the day. He pulled the stitches tight, knotted the thread, trimmed the ends. The repair was solid, ugly, and functional. They sat by the fire again. Hildegard spun wool on a drop spindle, the weight twisting and falling, her fingers deftly guiding the thread. The spindle made a soft, whirring hum as it spun. Gottfried simply stared into the flames, watching the logs crackle and spit, the shapes within the fire constantly shifting, but ultimately going nowhere. The snow was falling more steadily now. A silent white curtain passed the window. His thoughts, insofar as he had any, were of the next day's work. The parish after Heimbach was Metnich. He remembered that the previous year, the Metnich submission had been problematic. The priest there was old and forgetful, and had a tendency to confuse his measures. Last year, he reported 20 measures of rye, without specifying whether they were bushels or the smaller local win measure. It had required 3 separate messages to clarify. Gottfried hoped this year's submission would be clearer. If not, it would mean more correspondence, more delays. But even that was not a crisis. It was simply another step in the process, another small problem to be solved with patience and reference to the correct documents. The fire burned lower. The whir of the spindle slowed as Hildegard finished her length of thread. The snow continued to fall, muffling the outside world. The day, in all its profound uneventfulness, was done. It had been a good day. No disasters, no surprises, no great triumphs. Just work, accurately completed. A day like a well-laid stone in a wall, unremarkable but necessary and solid. Gottfried went to bed. The pallet crackled. He pulled the wool blankets up to his chin. The cold air of the room nipped at his face, but beneath the covers, he was warm. He listened. The snow made the world outside silent, a deep, absorbing quiet. There was no wind. The house creaked once and settled. He could hear Hildegard's steady breathing from across the room. He closed his eyes. In the Episcopal granary at Oberstein, the snow was already layering on the thatched roof, adding a blanket of silence over the rustling of the mice. The old guard had been relieved. The new guard was a younger man, more alert. He paced occasionally to keep warm, his footsteps a soft, regular crunch in the dust and chaff near the door. He watched his breath fog in the air. He thought about his wife, about the stew she would have made, about his child, who was learning to walk. His thoughts were simple, personal, and untroubled by the contents of the sacks and barrels he guarded. They were just grain. His job was to make sure no one stole it. It was a straightforward duty on a cold night. At one point, he thought he heard a noise outside. A soft thump. He grasped his spear, went to the door, and peered out into the swirling white. It was nothing. Just a clump of snow falling from a tree branch. He went back to his post, stamped his feet, and resumed his pacing. The granary stood, a silent, dark bulk in the falling snow, holding its mundane treasure. Nothing happened. And so, dear listener, as Gottfried drifts into a sleep deepened by routine and slight fatigue, and as the young guard watches the snow fall on a granary full of grain that has been counted and recounted, let yourself sink into this rhythm. The story does not accelerate. It does not twist. It simply continues, like the falling snow, each flake a tiny, insignificant detail, together creating a blanket of quietness that covers everything. Tomorrow, there will be Metnich and its ambiguous measures. There will be the ongoing saga of Reinhardt's draft. There will be the soup at midday, the walk home in the twilight, the mending of something else, the stare into the fire. We will explore, perhaps, the process by which the tallow for the dips is rendered, or the method of grating wool by touch and smell. We will consider the life of the goose whose quill Gottfried uses, not as a narrative, but as a series of biological and practical facts. Its diet of grass and grain, the seasonal molting of its feathers, the ideal age for plucking a flight feather for penmanship, a deep, warm ocean of the ordinary, a lullaby of the logistical. So let go now. Release the need for plot. Relinquish the desire for stakes. Surrender to the soothing, repetitive wave of details about a time and a place where the biggest problem was a missing chicken and the correct conversion rate for millet. Let Gottfried's minor, manageable world become the entire world. There is peace here, in the dusty parchment, in the scratch of the quill, in the falling snow. There is sleep here, in the endless, boring, beautiful history of nothing much at all. Let the snow fall. Let the quill scratch. Let the soup simmer. Breathe in and out. And as you exhale, let yourself sink deeper and deeper into the soft, gray, wonderfully dull embrace of a past that asks nothing of you but your indifference. The story is already telling itself in a whisper, and it has only just begun. You are absolutely right. That was merely the beginning. Let the gentle, unbroken river of tranquility continue to flow. Let us sink deeper into the sublime mundanity, where every detail is a pebble in the still pond of rest. The snow continued through the night, a silent, persistent laborer laying a thick white blanket over Sankt Wendel. When Gottfried woke, the quality of the light in his attic room was different. A pale, blue-white glow reflected from the snow below, seeped around the shutters, illuminating the motes of dust in the air. The cold was sharper, more penetrating. Downstairs, Hildegard was already breaking the ice on the water bucket with a small hammer. The sound was a clear, sharp tink, 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 a miniature chime marking the morning. The walk to the chancery was transformed. The familiar muddy ruts were gone, smoothed over into an unbroken expanse of white, marked only by the trails of early risers, the deep grooves of a cart, the paw prints of a dog, the wandering, purposeful track of a hunting cat. The world was hushed. The usual clamor of the town was muffled by the snow. The blacksmith's hammer, the fuller's beat, even the market cries, all were softened, as if heard through a thick woolen curtain. Gottfried's boots made a satisfying crunch-crunch with each step, a rhythmic, solitary sound. His breath plumed before him in great white gusts. He saw Reinhardt ahead, a dark, bundled figure leaving a parallel trail of footprints. They met at the courtyard gate, nodded a greeting made wordless by the cold, and crunched together across the pristine white of the courtyard, their twin paths the first to mar its perfect surface. Inside the scriptorium, the cold was, if anything, more intense. The stone walls seemed to have drunk the chill of the night and were now breathing it back into the room. The ink in Gottfried's pot was sluggish, almost gelatinous. He would have to hold the pot near the brazier for a few minutes to thin it to a usable consistency. Reinhardt, predictably, was immediately consumed by his draught. "The snow!" he hissed as they unwrapped their scarves. "It's driven the cold right through the wall. The draught is now less of a whistle and more of a persistent icy breath. It's aimed directly at my ankles. I shall lose a toe to frostbite before Epiphany. I am certain of it." Gottfried, his mind already turning towards the ambiguous measures of Metnik, offered only a sympathetic murmur. He placed his ink pot on the edge of the brazier's metal grate, careful not to let it grow too hot. He then unrolled the Northern Parish roll and retrieved the submission from Father Leofric of Metnich. It was, as feared, problematic. The handwriting was a spidery, trembling script. It read, "In the name of the Lord, received at Michaelmas, of grain, 20 measures, good and clean. Of swine, 2 fattened. Of wool, 3 sacks. God's blessing upon our good bishop." "Measures," Gottfried said aloud, the word hanging in the frigid air like another plume of breath. "And the sacks. What measures? What sacks?" Reinhardt, blowing on his fingers, glanced over. "Leofric. He measures with his heart, not with a bushel. Last year it was hods. The year before, baskets. You'll have to send to the parish steward for clarification." This was the expected outcome, but it was frustrating. Sending a message to Metnik would take a day for the writer to go, a day for the steward, a slow-witted, deliberate man named Jürgen, to consult his own notes and the aging priest, and a day for the writer to return. 3 days, at least, during which the Metnik entry would sit incomplete, a blank space on the roll that would irritate Herr Berthold's sense of order. But procedure was procedure. Gottfried took a fresh piece of scrap parchment and began to draft a query. He must be precise. To the steward of the Metnik range, Jürgen, greetings from the office of the Exchequer, Sankt Wendel, regarding the tithe submission for the year of our Lord, 1374. The entry for grain is given as 20 measures. By which standard is this measured? Is it the win measure, the episcopal bushel, or the Frankish quarter? Please specify. Furthermore, the wool is noted as..." He sanded the note, then melted a small stick of sealing wax over the brazier's flame, letting a single red droplet fall onto the folded parchment. He pressed the plain wooden stamp of the Exchequer's office into it, leaving a faint, generic impression of an eagle's wing. He would give it to the messenger boy after morning prayers. With Metnik stalled, he moved to the next parish on the list, Weiden. This submission was blessedly straightforward, penned by a young, newly appointed priest with a clear, pedagogical hand. Everything was in proper bushels, stones, and head count. The only mild curiosity was an addendum. Note, 1 cheese of the 6 promised was found to be riddled with mites upon inspection at the grange. It was condemned and fed to the pigs. I have deducted its value herewith. This was a responsible act, and one easily processed. Gottfried applied the standard value for a cheese, then subtracted it. The arithmetic was simple, almost soothing in its clarity. The scratch of his quill, the soft crackle of the fire, the occasional sigh from Reinhardt as he shifted his feet away from his personal glacial breeze. These were the melodies of the morning. Shortly before midday, Herr Berthold entered, his fur-trimmed robe seeming a sensible choice for once. He carried a ledger under his arm. The snow will delay the carters from the south, he announced to the room at large, though only Gottfried and Reinhardt were present. The wax and parchment shipment from mines will be late. Use your supplies sparingly. He stopped at Gottfried's desk. Metnish? Ambiguous measures, Herr Berthold. I have sent for clarification. Berthold's face clouded. Leofric. That old man's mind is as porous as a sieve. 3 days at least. Very well. Do not let it hold up the rest. Proceed to Altenkirchen next. Their submission is always late, but when it arrives, it is usually correct. A family of millers there. They understand numbers. Yes, sir. The day proceeded with this quiet administrative rhythm. Gottfried completed Weiden and moved on to a smaller hamlet, Haschbach. Here, a different issue arose. The tithe included 4 dozen squirrel pelts, a common form of payment from forested parishes. The schedule for pelts was complex, accounting for the season of trapping. Winter pelts were thicker. The color, pure gray, was more valuable than reddish, and whether they were matched in size for garment making. The priest had simply written, squirrel pelts, 4 dozen. Gottfried would have to apply the median value, which always felt like an approximation, a slight smudge on the perfect accuracy he sought. He made another, marginal note. Pelts valued at standard median. Could not ascertain season or quality. During a lull, as he prepared a new sheet of vellum for the fair copy of the completed entries, his mind wandered to the physical process of its creation. The vellum had come from the monastery's own sheep. The skin would have been soaked in a lime solution to loosen the hair, then stretched on a frame, a hearse, and scraped meticulously with a lunulum, a crescent-shaped blade. It would have been smoothed with pumice, then dusted with chalk, just as he had done himself for the final roll. This sheet was of moderate quality. He could see faint, healed scar lines from the animal's life, and a slight variation in thickness near one edge. It was not good enough for a charter or a Bible, but it was perfectly acceptable for financial records that would be stored in a chest and consulted only once or twice a generation. He appreciated its texture, its slight tooth, the way it held the ink without bleeding. It was a good, honest piece of workmanship. The snow continued to fall intermittently throughout the day, a lazy, silent spectator to their labors. When the bell for vespers tolled, Gottfried's back was stiff, his eyes tired, but he had progressed. The roll was slowly filling. The world of the northern parishes was being transformed from a collection of rustic promises into a column of precise, inked numbers. It was a translation as profound, in its way, as any from Latin to the vernacular. The translation of agricultural surplus into administrative fact. The walk home was in near darkness, the sky a deep violet, the snow glowing with a faint internal light. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe deeply. At home, the world was reduced to the radius of the hearth's warmth. Hildegard had made a peas pottage, thickened with barley and flavored with a ham bone. It was the color of mud, but it was hot and filling. They ate in silence, listening to the wind, which had picked up, sighing around the eaves and driving fine crystals of snow against the shutters with a sound like sand being thrown. After supper, Gottfried's task was to prepare a new batch of ink. His personal supply was running low. He had the ingredients: a small pouch of crushed oak galls, a lump of ferrous sulfate, a chip of gum arabic. He used a personal recipe, slightly different from the monastic one, that he felt gave a blacker, less glossy line. He heated rainwater in a small iron pot over the fire, added the galls, and let them simmer. The room filled with a tannic, astringent smell. After a while, he added the greenish crystal of ferrous sulfate, stirring with a stick. The liquid turned a deep, sinister black almost immediately. Finally, he crumbled in the gum arabic to thicken and bind the mixture. He stirred until it was smooth, then poured it through a linen cloth into his cleaned ink pot. Straining out the gall fragments, he would let it settle overnight. The process was methodical, alchemical in a minor, domestic way. It was a task that connected him to scribes across centuries, all performing this same quiet ritual to make the words possible. He cleaned the small pot and the stick meticulously. The residual ink on the stick was a pure, velvety black. He looked at it for a moment, this simple, profound substance that held the power of record. Then he placed the stick in the kindling box to be burned later. Hildegard was carding wool, pulling the raw, dirty clumps through 2 spiked paddles to align the fibers. The repetitive, calming sound. Jush, jush, jush was a perfect complement to the wind outside. It was a sound of industry without urgency, of preparation for a future that was no more complicated than a spun thread, a woven cloth, a mended tunic. Gottfried sat again, his ink-making done. He had no other tasks. He simply sat, feeling the warmth of the fire on his skin, the fullness of the pottage in his stomach, the mild fatigue in his hands and eyes from the day's ride. His mind was a quiet pool. The problem of Mettnich's measures was a pebble that had been thrown in. The ripples had faded. The fox-eaten chickens of Oberthal were a settled matter. The draft in Reinhardt's corner was a distant, humorous anecdote. There was nothing to plan, nothing to fear, nothing to eagerly anticipate. There was only the present, the fire, the carting, the wind, the settling of the new ink in its pot on the shelf. In the granary at Oberstein, the snow had drifted against the north wall, piling high. The young guard had been joined by a second, and they huddled together by the brazier, sharing a skin of wine. They talked in low voices about the winter, about how deep the snow might get, about a girl in the village one of them fancied. Their talk was circular, pointless, warm. They stamped their feet. They checked the door latch. They peered out at the white, swirling night. All was secure. All was quiet. The grain sat in the dark, the mice temporarily subdued by the deep cold. The only movement was the slow, almost imperceptible settling of the grain in the sacks, a microscopic shift towards equilibrium. And so the night deepened, and as you listen, let these two scenes, the warm, firelit room with its scents of wool and ink and peas pottage, and the cold, dark granary with its murmuring guards and sleeping grain, merge in your mind. They are two halves of the same whole, the record and the reality, the calculation and the commodity, the quiet industry of the clerk and the silent watchfulness of the guard. There is no conflict between them, only a slow, symbiotic rhythm of preservation and account. Tomorrow, the message will be on its way to Mettnich. Tomorrow, Gottfried will begin on Altenkirchen, and perhaps Reinhardt will finally resort to nailing a piece of sacking over the entire drafty corner of the wall. Aesthetics be damned. Tomorrow, Hildegard might churn butter, a rhythmic thumping sound that will last for an hour. Tomorrow, the guards will change shifts. The snow will melt a little if the sun emerges, or it will freeze harder if it does not. The story does not progress. It simply continues. It is a wheel that turns without advancing, and the turning is its own purpose. So let us continue to turn with it, slowly, in the dark, to the rhythm of the carding wool, the sighing wind, and the soft, endless fall of snow, upon a world where nothing of great moment is happening, and where, at last, your busy, chattering mind can find the deep, restorative silence it has been seeking. The fire burns lower, the candle gutters. The night is vast, and cold, and still, and in the quiet scriptorium of history, a quill rests in its holder, waiting for the dawn. The world of Sankt Wendel did not so much wake the next day as it gradually hardened into a new state of being. The snow had stopped, but the cold had intensified, seizing the landscape in a crystalline grip. The sky was a brittle, pale blue, the color of a frozen lake. Every surface, the thatched roofs, the timber frames of the houses, the wellhead in the square, was sheathed in a thick, glittering layer of hoarfrost. It was as if the entire town had been breathed upon by a giant and delicate glass blower. The usual morning sounds were different. The clatter of a pail had a sharper, more metallic ring, and the creak of a door was a protest of wood and an iron contracting in the cold. Gottfried's breath clouded so thickly before his face as he walked that he seemed to be walking through his own personal weather system. The snow crunched with a higher, more granular pitch under his boots, the sound of walking on crushed sugar. He saw the messenger boy, a red-nosed youth named Klaus, already mounted on a shaggy pony at the courtyard gate, the query for Metnich tucked inside his tunic. The boy gave a miserable nod, his eyes watering from the cold, and nudged the pony into a slow walk towards the north road, its hooves breaking through the icy crust with a series of dull thumps. The scriptorium was, predictably, an icy house. The brazier seemed to do little more than hold a small circle of warmth at its own feet, beyond which the cold radiated from the stone walls with palpable force. Reinhardt had arrived earlier and had taken radical action. He had not just nailed sagging over the drafty corner. He had constructed a small fortification of sorts, a low barrier of folded parchment scrap, weighted down with a stone ledger, created a bulwark around his feet. He had then draped an old threadbare cloak over his legs and the barrier, creating a tent-like structure from which only his torso and head emerged. He looked like a scribe who had been partially swallowed by a small fabric-covered mountain. "It is a stopgap," he announced, his voice slightly muffled, "but it traps the air. My own breath provides a modicum of insulation. It's a theory, at least." Gottfried, his fingers already stiff, set about his own routine. He placed the ink pot in the coals, not just on the edge. It was a risk. Overheating could ruin the ink, but necessity dictated it. He flexed his hands, blew on them, and unrolled the submission from Altenkirchen. Her Berthold was correct. It had arrived late, but it was a model of clarity. The family of millers who dominated the parish, the Braun brothers, understood measures down to the ounce. The submission was written in a bold, no-nonsense hand, likely by the eldest brother, Matthias. It listed grain not only by type and quantity, but by estimated milling yield, a detail beyond the requirements of the tithe, but one that spoke of a professional pride in the product. The morning was spent in the peaceful absorption of these impeccable figures. 14 bushels, 2 pecks of winter wheat, noted as hard red, good for fine flour. 21 bushels of rye, standard milling grade. The calculations were straightforward, a smooth flowing river of arithmetic compared to the rocky fort of Oberthel's fractions. Gottfried found himself appreciating the Braun brothers, their invisible, orderly minds reflected in the neat columns on the parchment. He thought of their mill, somewhere on the frozen river beyond the town, its great wheel locked in ice, the interior doubtless filled with the good, dusty smell of grain and the solid, patient presence of millstones. It was a pleasing image, industry in repose, waiting for the thaw. Midday brought a minor scriptorial drama. Reinhardt, in adjusting his foot tent, accidentally kicked the leg of his desk. A small clay cup holding his supply of pumice powder, used for smoothing vellum, toppled over. The fine white powder exploded across a section of the vestment inventory he was copying, obscuring several lines of text and coating his hands in the front of his tunic in a ghostly dust. "Verdammt," he hissed, a rare outburst. He spent the next quarter hour in a slow, careful salvage operation, using a soft brush to gently sweep the powder from the parchment onto a scrap of leather, trying to recover as much of the expensive material as he could. The incident created a cloud of floating particles that hung in the sunbeam from the high window, turning the light into a tangible, swirling substance. Gottfried watched the motes dance, a silent, chaotic ballet in the still, cold air, until they gradually settled, dusting every surface in the room with a microscopic layer of white. It was an event. Past. The afternoon was dedicated to the fair copy. This was a different quality of work. It required not calculation, but a steady hand and absolute concentration. A single slip, a blot, a misspelled word could ruin a large sheet of prepared vellum and waste hours of labor. Gottfried selected his finest quill, one he reserved for such tasks, from the primary wing feather of a swan he had obtained years ago from a hunter. It had a perfect, resilient nib. He warmed his hands over the brazier one last time, adjusted the angle of the parchment on his desk, and began. He did not simply copy. He transcribed into the formal curving script of the chancery, using the established abbreviations for common words. The first stroke of the quill was a commitment. The ink flowed perfectly, thanks to his careful preparation the night before. It laid down a dense, matte, black line that clung to the chalky surface of the vellum without feathering. He wrote the heading, Compotus Decimarum, Parochiae Septentrionalis, Anno Domini, Michiel Etziafti. Then, parish by parish, he recreated the world of the Northern District in flawless script. Niedertel, 169 pence. Oberthal, 287 pence, with a marginal query about the chickens. Haydn, 94 pence. Each sum was a tiny monument, a financial tombstone for a year's agricultural labor. His world shrank to the tip of the swan's quill, the slow unspooling of ink, the faint, dry sound of the nib moving across the surface. His breathing slowed. His entire being was focused on the line, the curve of a AC, the crossbar of a AT. Time lost its meaning, measured only in lines completed, in parishes recorded. He was so immersed that he did not notice Herr Berthold approaching. The deputy exchequer's shadow falling across the parchment made him start, his hand jerking slightly and leaving a tiny, unintended serif on the downstroke of a AEPPA. He froze, a flush of annoyance at himself warming his cheeks. But Berthold was not looking for errors. He was peering at the work with an appraising eye. "The swan quill?" he asked, his voice low. "Yes, Herr Berthold." "Good. The line is consistent. The spacing is even." He leaned closer. "You are using the older form of the abbreviation for measure. See here. In the margin for Metnich where you've left space. The modern form is a simple with a tilde. You've used the with a descending loop." Gottfried's heart sank. It was a trivial point of scribal fashion, but Berthold was a traditionalist in such matters. I copied it from the 1352 schedule, sir, for consistency within the roll." Berthold was silent for a moment, his eyes tracing the line. The 1032 schedule. A point of precedent. Very well. Consistency is paramount. Proceed." He straightened up. "The messenger will not be back from Metnich until the day after tomorrow at the earliest. The snow is deep on the North Road. Use the time for the fair copy. I want the northern roll sealed before the feast of St. Lucy." "Yes, sir." Berthold moved away, his footsteps echoing in the cold room. Gottfried let out a slow breath, looking at the tiny, errant serif on the EPP. It was a flaw, a microscopic betrayal of his concentration, but it was not a catastrophic one. He could not correct it. Scraping vellum was risky and would leave a thin, weak spot. It would have to remain. The perfect record was now, in one infinitesimal way, imperfect. He accepted it. It was part of the work. He dipped his quill again and continued. The rest of the afternoon passed in this deep, flowing state. The light from the high window moved across the floor, faded, and turned the color of old ale. Gottfried completed the entries for Weiden and Haschbach, the neat column of figures growing. When the bell for vespers rang, he had filled nearly 2 feet of the roll. He carefully sanded the last line, capped his precious swan quill, and leaned back. His neck ached from being held in one position for so long. His eyes felt dry and gritty, but there was a profound satisfaction in the physical evidence of his labor. The crisp black text on the pale cream vellum, a thing of quiet beauty in its own functional way. The walk home was in the deep blue twilight that follows a clear frozen day. The stars were beginning to prick through, sharp and bright as diamond chips. The hoarfrost on the trees and eaves caught the last of the light, making the town look as though it were decorated with millions of tiny, fragile sequins. The cold was so intense it felt like a presence, a silent, crystalline entity holding the world in suspension. Gottfried moved through it, a dark, breathing shape in a frozen diorama. At home, Hildegard had performed a small miracle. She had managed to trade some of her spun wool for a piece of salted cod from a traveling merchant. She had soaked it to remove some of the salt, then baked it with the last of the year's wrinkled apples and a handful of oats in a pastry coffin. The smell that filled the low room was extraordinary. Fishy, sweet, earthy, and rich with the scent of baked grain. It was a feast by their standards. They ate it slowly, savoring the unfamiliar flavors. The cod was firm and flaky. The apples had softened into a tart pulp. The pastry was thick and filling. They said little, focused on the meal. Afterward, feeling unusually replete, Gottfried did not even take up his usual mending. He simply sat, a cup of weak beer in his hand, and stared at the fire, letting the warmth and the fullness spread through him. Hildegard, too, was quiet. Her spinning was done for the day. She sat with her hands in her lap looking into the flames. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the occasional pop from a pocket of sap in a log. "The cobbler's cough is worse," she said after a long while. "I took him some thyme and honey. He thanked me, but he sounds like a saw on green wood." Gottfried nodded. There was nothing more to say. Illness was a fact, like the cold. You offered what comfort you could, and you waited. Later, in bed, the cold was a fierce adversary. The warmth from the hearth did not penetrate to the attic. Gottfried pulled the wool blankets up over his nose, leaving only a small tunnel for air. He could see his breath rising in a faint, steady stream in the moonlight that now streamed through the unshuttered window, illuminating the frost patterns on the inside of the glass. They were ferns and feathers and swirling galaxies, etched by the invisible breath of the winter night. He lay still, letting his body heat slowly warm the cocoon of bedding. The stiffness from the day's writing began to ease. He thought of the fair copy, of the tiny flaw on the EPP. He thought of the messenger boy, Klaus, spending the night in some snowbound shepherd's hut on the road to Metnik. He thought of the frozen mill wheel at Altenkirchen. These thoughts were not worries. They were simply images, passing through his mind like the clouds of his breath passed through the moonbeam. There and then gone. In the granary at Oberstein, the cold was even more absolute. The two guards on duty had given up on dignity and were huddled together under a single thick horse blanket, their backs against a stack of grain sacks for insulation. They had stopped talking. The effort of forming words seemed to waste precious warmth. They simply sat, breathing slowly, watching the glow of the brazier coals, which provided more light than heat. The granary was a cathedral of cold and silence. The grain, however, was safe. The extreme cold inhibited the mice and kept the grain dry and free from mold. It was, in its way, ideal storage weather. The guard's suffering was the price paid for the perfect preservation of the bishop's rye and barley. They did not think of it in those terms. They thought of their numb feet and of the relief of the dawn shift. The next day dawned exactly the same. Clear, blindingly bright, and bitterly cold. The hoarfrost was, if anything, thicker. Gottfried's routine was now set in the ice. Warm the ink, flex the hands, work on the fair copy. Today he would complete the entries for the smaller hamlets. Nanshausen, Weisweiler, perhaps even start on the tricky forest parish of Sien, which paid partly in timber rights and honey. Commodities that required a separate, confusing schedule of their own. Reinhardt had refined his foot fortress. He had added a second layer of sacking and had inserted a heated stone, wrapped in leather, at the base of his parchment bulwark. He reported a marked improvement, though his feet were still cold. Morning passed in silent industry. Gottfried entered Nanshausen, 112 pence, and Weisweiler, 87 pence. He paused at Sien. The submission here was on a piece of birch bark, as expected, written in a brown ink made from oak galls, but without the iron, giving it a rusty, faint quality. It listed 10 cartloads of firewood, beech, and oak, cut to cathedral length, 5 stone of honey in the comb, 20 martenskins prime, 2 pounds of beeswax cleaned. This required a shift in mental gears. He put aside the grain schedules and retrieved the schedule of non-agrarian tithes and renders for parishes within the Ardenwold. The value of firewood was calculated per cord, not per cartload. He needed to know the size of the carts. The honey was valued by quality. Spring honey from fruit blossoms was worth more than later summer honey from heather. The priest had not specified. The martenskins were valuable, but needed grading. The beeswax was straightforward. He would have to make a series of educated estimations, each one noted as such. It was work that required judgment as well as calculation. A slight step up in complexity that was just enough to keep his mind engaged without straining it. He decided to value the cartloads as standard forest carts, which the schedule defined as a load a strong man may draw. He applied the median value for honey. He valued the martenskins at the lower end of prime to be safe. Each decision was a small administrative puzzle, solved with reference to precedent and a dash of conservative guesswork. He was so engrossed in converting martenskins into pence that he did not hear the outer door open. A blast of even colder air swirled into the room, followed by the stomping of boots and a familiar, weary voice. By all the saints, it's cold enough to freeze the devil's tail off. It was Klaus, the messenger boy. He stood in the doorway, crusted with snow to his thighs, his face raw and wind-burned, his eyelashes stuck together with ice crystals. He looked half-frozen, but triumphant. Gottfried and Reinhardt stared. He was a day early. Klaus fumbled inside his tunic with clumsy, mittened hands and pulled out a damp, but intact, piece of parchment. He held it out. From Jürgen, the steward at Metnik. He was in a foul mood. Said the priest couldn't remember, and he had to measure the storage bins himself. But he answered. Gottfried took the parchment. It was cold to the touch. He unrolled it. The writing was a clumsy, laborious print. To the exchequer. The measures are the wind measure, the same as always. The sacks of wool are 3 of the large sacks from the shearing shed. They hold 4 bushels, each by volume, or about 10 stone weight of wool if packed tight. Jürgen! It was not perfect. The conflation of volume and weight was typical of Jürgen, but it was enough. Wind measures were on the schedule. 4 bushel sacks were a known quantity. Gottfried could now complete Metnish. You made good time, Klaus, Reinhardt said, impressed. The cold, Klaus said, shuffling closer to the brazier and holding his red hands directly over the coals. It's hard, but it freezes the track solid. The pony could walk on top of the crust most of the way. No mire, just coal. He shivered violently. Gottfried fetched a spare cup and poured the boy some of the thin, sour ale from their jug. Klaus drank it greedily, the liquid dripping from his chin. He would be paid a farthing for the trip and get a hot meal in the kitchens. For him, this was a grand adventure, a tale of hardship survived. For Gottfried, it was the removal of an obstacle. The universe of the Northern Roll was one step closer to completion. He dismissed Klaus to the kitchens and returned to his desk. With the clarification in hand, the Metnich entry, which had been a blank space of potential bother, resolved into a simple calculation: 25 wind measures of rye. He converted wind measures to standard bushels, a ratio of 1.2 to 1, applied the prices and deductions. 3 large sacks of wool at 10 stone each. He applied the price for unwashed wool per stone. He summed the totals. The number, when it finally emerged on his wax tablet, was pleasingly round. 240 pence, exactly. He transcribed it onto the fair copy in his flawless script, filling the blank space. The roll was now seamless, uninterrupted. The tiny flaw in the EP from the day before was forgotten, absorbed into the greater whole of a completed record. He sat back. A significant milestone had been reached. The northern roll was, but for the complex render from CN, essentially complete. He would finish scene tomorrow, and then the fair copy could be finalized, rolled, sealed with the exchequer's official seal in warm red wax, and placed in the oak chest where it would reside, untouched, for a year or a decade or a century, until some future clerk just like him needed to know the tithe yield of Niederthel in the year 1374. The satisfaction was deep and quiet. It was the satisfaction of a wall built, a field harvested, a well dug. It was the satisfaction of order imposed on chaos, of numbers taming the messy reality of geese and foxes and forgetful old priests. It was not a joy that made one want to sing. It was a contentment that made one want to sit quietly, as he did now, and watch the afternoon light, knowing that the day's work was good. As the pale sun began to sink, casting long blue shadows across the snow, Gottfried cleaned his tools with extra care. The crisis of the cold, the drama of the returned messenger, the minor triumph of the completed calculation. All of it faded into the calm routine of closing the day. He and Reinhardt walked home together, their breath mingling in the violet air, their footsteps the only sound in the frozen world. That night, after another simple meal, Gottfried did not even think of work. He sat by the fire, and for the first time in days, his mind was truly, utterly blank. Not empty in a worried way, but in a peaceful, saturated way, like a sponge that can hold no more water. He listened to the fire, to the wind, which had picked up again, promising more snow, to the steady rhythmic sound of Hildegard's knitting needles, a new skill she was practicing, the soft click-click, a gentle mechanical heartbeat in the room. In the granary, the guards changed. The frozen night shift began. A wolf howled. A long, lonely sound that echoed across the snowy hills, but it was far away and posed no threat to the thick doors and stone walls. The grain slept on. The numbers were now safe on the vellum, and the reality was safe in the sacks. All was accounted for. All was secure. And so, as the wind moaned its old song and the fire burned down to embers, the world of Sankt Wendel, a world of small duties, minor discomforts, and quiet completions, settled into the deep, cold heart of winter. There were no more words needed. The story was simply being, moment by uneventful moment, a lullaby written in hoarfrost and ledger lines, in the scratch of a quill and the crunch of snow, in the space between one breath and the next, in the long, boring, beautiful history of a winter's night in the year 1374. The wind kept its promise. The next morning, the world outside was a shifting, roaring whiteness. The blizzard had come in the deep hours of the night, and now it scoured the town, hurling snow not in gentle flakes but in hard, horizontal pellets that stung any exposed skin. Visibility was reduced to a few feet. Familiar landmarks, the gable of the baker's house, the sign of the tavern, were spectral shapes that appeared and vanished in the swirling maelstrom. No one went to the chancery. It was not a declared holiday. Such a concept did not exist. It was simply an unspoken understanding, enforced by the sheer physical impossibility of the endeavor. To venture out in this was to risk becoming lost and frozen within a stone's throw of your own door. So Sankt Wendel hunkered down. Each household became its own isolated island in a white sea, connected only by the shared sound of the storm. In the attic room, Gottfried and Hildegard listened to the fury outside. The wind screamed in the chimney, trying to force its way down and blow smoke back into the room. It rattled the shutters with a violence that threatened to tear them from their hinges. The world was reduced to this, the small, defiant circle of warmth around the hearth, the howl of the void beyond the walls. There was no possibility of work. The light was too dim for writing, even if he had wished to. The cold that seeped through the walls and floor was a tangible enemy, and their energy was devoted to holding it at bay. Hildegard kept the fire fed with the seasoned logs they had stored in the autumn, using them sparingly but steadily. Gottfried's task was to ensure the draft was strong enough to pull the smoke up the chimney, but not so strong that it sucked all the heat from the room. He adjusted the flue damper, a simple leather flap on a stick, with minute care, watching the behavior of the flames and the smoke. They spoke little. The storm was too loud for casual conversation. They communicated in gestures and shared looks. Hildegard prepared a thin gruel from oats and water, the most basic of sustenance, cooked over the fire. They ate it slowly, for there was nothing else to do. Time, which in the scriptorium was measured in tasks, here became measured in the consumption of fuel. Each log represented a certain span of warmth. They watched the pile diminish with a quiet mutual understanding. In the lulls between the fiercest gusts, other sounds penetrated. The desperate barking of a dog, the groan of a nearby roof taking the weight of snow, the distant, calamitous crack and thud of a branch breaking under its icy burden. These sounds served only to emphasize their own fragile security. Gottfried's mind, deprived of its usual scaffolding of numbers and parchment, began to wander in a loose, undirected way. He thought of the fair copy, rolled in safe in his satchel at the foot of his bed. He thought of Cien and the honey. He wondered if the bees in their hives in the Ardenwald forest were clustered together for warmth, their queen at the center, surviving on their own stored sweet. It was a better fate, perhaps, than being measured out by the stone for the bishop's table. He thought of Reinhardt, undoubtedly wrapped in every blanket he owned, engaged in his own private war against the cold in his drafty chamber. He thought of Herr Berthold, in his grander house with its larger hearths, perhaps reviewing other roles, unaffected by the weather because his fuel supply was vast. These thoughts came and went, without urgency or connection, like fish glimpsed in a deep, slow-moving river. The day passed in this strange, suspended state. They dozed by the fire. They mended small things, a tear in a sack, a loose handle on a pot, tasks that required little light or concentration. They listened to the storm. It was a day outside of days, a pocket of non-time forced upon them by nature. By late afternoon, the fury began to abate. The howl diminished to a moan, then to a sigh. The horizontal drive of the snow eased, and it began to fall straight down again, thick and heavy. The world outside the window was a uniform, featureless white, but it was no longer a violent white. The storm had blown itself out. The silence that followed was almost as profound as the noise had been. It was a thick, absorbing silence, the sound of a world buried and muffled. Gottfried pulled on his boots and his heaviest cloak and ventured to the door. Opening it was a struggle. A deep drift had piled against it. He pushed it ajar, enough to look out. The lane had vanished. In its place was a smooth, undulating dune of snow, higher than his waist in places. The houses opposite were half buried, their lower windows completely obscured. The sky was still a low gray blanket, but the snow had stopped. The air was perfectly still and bitingly cold. The world was new-made, blank, and utterly silent. He closed the door. "It will be a day of digging tomorrow," he said to Hildegard. She nodded. "Pragmatic. The woodpile is under there somewhere. That will be the first task." That evening, as they ate the last of the gruel, the sound of digging began elsewhere in the town. The familiar, rhythmic scrape thud of a shovel biting into packed snow. The grunt of effort. Others were beginning the reclamation. They would start theirs at first light. The next morning dawned clear and still, and colder than ever. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue. The sun, low on the horizon, glared off the snow with an eye-watering intensity. Every branch, every roof tile, every post was outlined in a thick, brilliant white. It was a world of stark, black and white, like a woodcut. Gottfried and Hildegard armed themselves with the household's single shovel and a flat piece of wood that served as a snow plate. They began the slow, arduous work of digging a path from their door to the lane, and then from the lane to where they estimated the woodpile to be. It was heavy, wet snow, and the labor was intense. Soon, despite the cold, Gottfried was sweating under his layers. His breath came in ragged plumes. The only sounds were the shovel, their breathing, and the occasional distant shout or laugh from others engaged in the same battle down the lane. It took 2 hours to reach the woodpile, a hump under a smooth white blanket. They dug it out carefully, brushing snow from the logs before carrying armfuls back to the house. The simple, physical exhaustion was a novel feeling. It was not the mental fatigue of calculation, nor the stiff ache of prolonged sitting. It was a clean, full-body weariness, born of direct struggle with the elements. It felt good. Later, as Gottfried made his way to the chancery, the town was a scene of slow, communal resurrection. Paths were being carved, roofs were being cleared with long poles, children were being marshaled to stamp down snow in the market square. There was a sense of shared purpose, of a community re-emerging. He saw Reinhardt, red-faced and puffing, helping an elderly neighbor dig out a doorway. They exchanged a wave. The scriptorium, when he finally reached it, was a scene of mild chaos. A leak had developed in the roof during the storm, and a slow drip had fallen onto an unused desk, creating a large, dark stain on the oak and a small puddle on the floor. Brother Simeon was there, looking mournfully at the stain. "The damp," he said, as if the single drip were a personal affront. "It finds a way. Always, it finds a way." Gottfried's own desk was untouched. He brushed a fine dusting of snow from its surface. It had blown in under the door and set about his routine. The fire in the brazier was slow to start. The charcoal was damp from the humid air, but eventually, a feeble warmth began to radiate. He took out the fair copy and the submission from Cien. Today, he would finish it. The work felt different after the storm. The silence of the snow-blanketed world outside seeped into the room, making it even more hushed than usual. The drip from the leak was a slow, irregular metronome. Plink, 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 plink. Reinhardt arrived, looking exhausted but satisfied from his digging. He surveyed the new leak with a professional eye. "That's a slate, shifted by the wind. The masons will need to see to it when the thaw comes. Not before Pentecost, I'd wager." Gottfried returned to the honey and the martenskins. In the quiet, his estimations felt more deliberate. He decided, after consulting the schedule once more, to upgrade the honey from median to spring blossom quality. The priest of Cien was an honest hermit, by all accounts, and would not overstate. The martenskins he left at the lower prime value. He calculated the firewood, the wax. The final sum for Cien was a peculiar number, 413 pence and 3 farthing. He transcribed it. The northern roll was complete. He spent the rest of the morning reviewing the entire fair copy, checking each entry against his wax tablet calculations. It was meticulous, tedious work, checking sums he had already checked, but it was the final seal on the project. He found one error. In Hashbach, he had transposed 2 digits, writing 79 pence instead of 97. A chill unrelated to the cold went through him. It was a significant error, one that would have unbalanced the total. Carefully, using a tiny, sharp knife, he scraped away the incorrect numerals. The vellum was thick, and he could remove the ink without piercing the skin. He then rewrote the correct number in the slight depression. It was not perfect. The patch was slightly smoother and whiter than the surrounding area, but it was legible and accurate. The flaw would be invisible once the roll was stored. He breathed a sigh of relief. The storm, the break in routine, had almost caused a lapse, but it was caught. At midday, Herr Berthold arrived, stamping snow from his boots. He inspected the new leak, grunted, and then came to Gottfried's desk. The northern roll. "Complete, sir. Save for the final summation and your seal." Berthold leaned over, his eyes scanning the final entries. He pointed a thick finger at the corrected number in hashbox. A correction? A transposition, sir. Caught and remedied. Good? The total. Gottfried had it ready. 1,018.22 pence. And 3 farthings. Berthold's eyebrows rose slightly. It was a healthy sum. The snow in the north was late. The harvest was good. It shows. He nodded, a gesture of supreme satisfaction. Prepare the final summation on a separate sheet for the cover. I will seal it this afternoon. This was the culmination. Gottfried took a small, perfect piece of vellum, cut for the purpose. In his most formal script, he wrote, Summa totalis decimarum, parochiarum septentrioneum, anno meclepsiarti4, MDCC 22, QD, et Q. He sanded it, blew the sand away, and attached it with a spot of wax to the beginning of the roll. The work was done. That afternoon, a small ceremony of bureaucracy took place. Herr Berthold heated the official seal of the Deputy Exchequer, an intricate brass matrix depicting a balance scale and a sheaf of wheat over a candle flame. He pressed it into a large pool of red sealing wax Gottfried had poured onto the tie of the rolled parchment. There was a hiss, a smell of hot wax and beeswax from the candle, and then the impression was made. Sharp, clear, official. The record was now a closed fact. Immutable. Berthold handed the heavy roll to Gottfried. To the archive, and then you may begin on the preliminary receipts for the spring tolls on the river traffic. The ice will break eventually. The journey to the archive with the completed roll felt like a procession. Brother Simeon received it with reverence, checking the seal was unbroken. He entered it in his ledger of holdings, noting its reference number, ENP 74.E4. He then carried it to a specific shelf, sliding it into a space between the rolls for 1373 and a gap waiting for 1375. It slotted in with a soft, final thump. It had joined history. Its active life was over. It would now sleep, perhaps for centuries, a silent witness to a year's yield, a winter's work, a clerk's careful hand. Gottfried returned to his desk. The space where the northern roll had been was empty. His wax tablet was blank, smoothed clean. His tools were neatly arranged. A chapter had closed. He felt a faint, pleasant melancholy, the sense of something completed and left behind. Then he opened the small iron-bound chest at his feet and withdrew a new sheaf of papers. The preliminary manifests from the river toll station at the bridge, recording goods that had passed through in the late autumn before the freeze. Wool, wine, iron ingots, salt. A different kind of calculation awaited, but not today. The light was fading. The cold was creeping back in. It was time to go home. That night, after a supper of the last of the salted cod baked into a bland but hot fish pie, Gottfried did something unusual. He took a small piece of parchment scrap, a nub of charcoal from the fire, and he drew. He was no artist. He drew the simple outline of a sheaf of wheat, and next to it, a column of numbers. Then he drew a snowdrift against a door, then a quill. They were childish, crude sketches, but they were a record of a sort. Not for an exchequer, but for himself, a memory of the completed task. The storm, the labor. He looked at it for a moment, then tossed it into the fire. The edges blackened, curled, the sheaf of wheat glowed orange, and then it was gone, consumed into warmth and light. It was enough that he had made it. In the archive, in the deep, consistent cold, the new roll rested between its siblings. A mouse, venturing out from the wainscoting, sniffed at the shelf, detected the smell of the parchment and the strange mineral scent of the ink, and turned away, seeking something more edible. In the granary at Oberstein, the guards reported that the storm had sealed the main door with a drift, and they had had to use the small postern gate. The grain was fine. The cold preserved it. And so, the rhythms re-established themselves. The great, exciting interruption of the blizzard became just another memory, another layer in the slow accumulation of days. The river toll manifest would provide a week's work. Then there would be the inventory of the bishop's wine cellar to assist with. Then the copying of the Easter week sermon for distribution to the rural priests. The wheel turned. The quill scratched. The snow melted, slowly, under a wan sun, revealing the mud and the filth beneath, which then froze again each night into a treacherous, rutted landscape. Days passed, then weeks. The profound cold eased, by increments so small they were only noticeable in retrospect. The days grew imperceptibly longer. One morning, walking to the chancery, Gottfried heard a new sound. The musical, erratic drip, drip, drip of meltwater falling from the icicles on the south-facing roofs. It was a fragile, hopeful sound. Winter's script was softening at the edges. In the scriptorium, Reinhardt finally won his war. The mason, summoned after Candlemas, when the freeze had relented enough for mortar to set, had properly repointed the crack in the wall. The draft was gone. Reinhardt had dismantled his foot fortress with the air of a general retiring after a victorious campaign. He now complained with nostalgia about the quiet. Gottfried worked his way through the river tolls. Calculations were different, percentages of value, duties on luxury goods. But the principle was the same. Apply the rule, make the calculation, keep the record. His world was still one of numbers on parchment, of ink and vellum, of quiet, methodical progress through a stack of tasks that never seemed to diminish, yet never overwhelm. One afternoon in early March, with a timid sun finally providing a whisper of genuine warmth through the window, Herr Berthold approached his desk again. He laid a single sheet of parchment before Gottfried. It was a list, but not of goods or money. It was a list of names, perhaps 24, written in a hurried, unfamiliar hand. The bishop's guest list for the Feast of the Annunciation, Berthold said. Various lords, abbots, and their retainers. They will be housed in the town. We are to allocate bed space and stabling. Cross-reference this with the census of available lodgings from last year. Ensure no household takes more than its fair share of burden. And for God's sake, keep the bishop's cousin, the one with the 16 horses, away from the widow Frau Hetzer. She has the largest stable, but she also has... It was a new kind of puzzle. Administrative, but social. It involved people, not bushels. Gottfried felt a flicker of something. Not excitement, but a slight quickening of interest. It was a problem of logistics and human nature. He took the list, retrieved the census scroll from the archive, enduring a short lecture from Brother Simeon on the acidity of certain inks, and began to work. He had to match rank with appropriate accommodation, consider the size of retinues, avoid placing long-standing rivals too close together. It was like a vast, quiet game of chess played with people and houses. He found he enjoyed it. It used a different part of his mind, one that considered relationships in space rather than purely numerical value. He worked on it for 2 days, creating a neat, annotated schedule. He assigned the bishop's horse-loving cousin to the inn by the west gate, which had a large, if somewhat dilapidated, stable, and whose owner was a placid man unlikely to complain. He placed the irritable abbot of Hornbach in the spacious, quiet home of a wealthy wool merchant who was seeking favor. He ensured the widow Frau Hetzer received only a minor canon with a single, elderly donkey. It was work that required tact and foresight, and when he presented the completed schedule to Herr Berthold, the deputy exchequer scanned it, grunted, and said, "Adequate!" From him, it was high praise. Life, in all its mundane complexity, flowed on. The frost left the ground. The first, brave green shoots of snowdrops appeared in sheltered corners of the courtyard. The world was slowly turning towards spring, and with it, the cycle of Gottfried's work would soon turn back towards the land, towards the preparations for sowing, and eventually towards the next harvest, and the next tithe roll. But for now, there was this moment. An afternoon in the scriptorium. The sun a pale yellow square on the stone floor. The sound of Reinhardt's pen, a comfortable, familiar whisper. The smell of ink and old wood, and the knowledge that a task had been completed well, and that another, different one had been handled with competence. There was no fanfare, no celebration, just the quiet hum of a system functioning as it should. Gottfried dipped his quill. A goose feather today, the swan quill resting, and began to draft a memorandum to the town bailiff regarding the cleaning of the main street in preparation for the bishop's guests. It was about removing dung and refuse and ensuring the cobbles were clear. It was not poetry. It was not history. Why? It was administration. The careful, boring, essential work of keeping a small part of the world orderly, one line, one calculation, one logistical decision at a time. And as he wrote, the sun moved across the floor. The dust motes danced in its beam, and the great, slow, uneventful river of time flowed on, carrying with it the tiny, insignificant, yet utterly real world of Sankt Wendel, its clerk, its granaries, its snows, and its quiet, endless, beautifully boring in history. The final drip of the icicles became a trickle, then a steady stream carving sinuous channels in the softening snow. The air lost its knifing edge, acquiring instead a damp, earthy chill that spoke of thaw and the latent life beneath the mud. The great white blanket over Sankt Wendel grew thin, threadbare, and finally dissolved into a universal boot-sucking mire. The lane outside Gottfried's house, which had been a frozen river of ruts, became a treacherous soup of churned mud, straw, and less pleasant things. The town exchanged one form of discomfort for another, but this one felt like progress. It smelled of decay, yes, but also of potential. In the chancery, the mood shifted with the season. The perpetual shiver had left the stone walls, replaced by a clammy, pervasive damp. The fire in the brazier was kept smaller now, more for the comfort of its light than its heat. The great winter projects, the tithe roll, the toll manifests, were complete, sealed, and archived. The work now turned to the forward-looking tasks of spring, the inventories of seed grain held in the episcopal stores, the assessment of repairs needed to tithe barns after the weight of the snow, the budgeting for the annual repainting of the choir screen in the cathedral, a task involving precise estimates for linseed oil, ground pigments, and gold leaf. Gottfried found himself assigned to the seed grain inventory. It was in many ways the mirror image of the tithe audit. Instead of receiving grain, the bishopric issued it. Loans of seed to tenant farmers, to be repaid with interest from the next harvest. The records were just as meticulous, but the flow was reversed. It was a ledger of hope and obligation, written in the same iron gall ink. He worked in the archive itself for this task, as the records were too bulky and fragile to move. Brother Simeon hovered nearby, a silent, dusty guardian, occasionally offering an unsolicited commentary on the penmanship of long-dead clerks. The ledgers were vast, their pages thick and soft with age. They smelled of cellar and slow oxidation. Day after day, Gottfried sat at a high desk in the archive's gloom, a single tallow dip illuminating the columns of figures. He was cross-referencing the issued loans from the spring of 1373, with the repayments recorded after the harvest of that same year. It was a check for defaults. Most entries were straightforward. To Johann, son of Henning, of Niederfell, 3 bushels rye seed, repaid 3.5 bushels, Michaelmas 1373. The extra half bushel was the interest, the bishopric's modest return for its risk. But some entries bore ominous annotations. Repaid 2 bushels, balance owing 1.5 bushels, note crop failure, blight, or simply not repaid, tenant deceased, holdings reverted. These were the small human tragedies embedded in the dry text. A family's luck had turned. A man had died. The ledger noted it without comment, a financial postscript to a life. One name appeared several times, always with a partial repayment. Caspar, of the Hillcroft near Sion. The debts were small, a bushel of oats, half a bushel of barley. But they accumulated. The notes were brief. Promise of payment at Martinus. Then, payment deferred to Lady Day. Gottfried felt a faint, impersonal sympathy for this unknown Caspar, struggling on his poor forest edge land. He would likely never meet him, but he knew his financial life in intimate, depressing detail. The work was slow, quiet, and deeply peaceful. The archive was a world apart, a capsule of silent history. The only sounds were the soft shush of a turning page, the scratch of his own pen adding a check mark or a query, and Brother Simeon's occasional dry cough. Time seemed to pool here, stagnant and deep. One afternoon, as he was nearing the end of the 1373 ledger, Herr Berthold entered the archive. He carried a smell of the outside world with him, damp wool and fresh air. He consulted with Brother Simeon in low tones about the storage of some newly arrived papal decrees, requiring their own indexing, then approached Gottfried. "The seed audit, how does it stand?" "Nearly complete for 73, sir. The default rate is within expected parameters. 4% by volume." Berthold nodded. "And the major defaulters?" "Mostly smallholders on marginal land. The usual. There is one, a Caspar, near Sion, with a cumulative debt of 4 bushels across 3 seasons." Berthold's eyes, which had been scanning the ledger over Gottfried's shoulder, narrowed slightly. "Caspar, the beekeeper. Yes, he is persistent. The bishop's forester reports he is a good woodsman. His debt is in grain, but his skill is in timber and honey. Note that. It may be we accept service in lieu. A week's labor coppicing hazel for the cathedral's charcoal burners could clear his debt. Make it." It was a small act of administrative mercy, a conversion of one kind of value into another. It acknowledged that the ledger, for all its numerical purity, existed in a world of flesh and blood and skill. Gottfried made the note, feeling an odd sense of satisfaction. The problem of Caspar had a potential solution, neat and practical. As Berthold turned to leave, he paused. "When you finish the 73 audit, begin on the projections for 74. The cellar master reports the stock of seed rye is high. We may increase the loans to the southern parishes by 10%. Draft a proposal with adjusted risk assessments." "Yes, sir." And so the work evolved, from auditing the past to planning the future. Gottfried moved from the dusty ledgers of 1373 to clean sheets for 1374. He compiled lists of eligible tenants, cross-referenced their past repayment histories, calculated the available grain in the stores, and proposed allocations. It was like building a house of cards, but with numbers and names. A satisfying, fragile construct. Outside, spring continued its hesitant advance. The market square, now clear of snow and mostly dry, began to fill with a different energy. The first cartloads of early produce appeared. Pale, forced greens, last year's withered apples from the root cellars, bundles of willow withes for basket making. The sound of lambs bleating carried from the pastures beyond the wall. One morning, a cuckoo called from the bishop's wood, its two-tone song a clear, liquid announcement that the turn of the year was irrevocable. In the scriptorium, the open window now brought in not a frigid draft, but a cool, fresh breeze carrying the scent of wet earth and budding hedgerow. Reinhardt had taken to complaining about the pollen making him sneeze. The drip from the repaired roof had long ceased, leaving only a dark stain as a memory of the winter's siege. Gottfried's days fell into the new rhythm. Mornings were often spent in the archive with the old ledgers. Afternoons were for the new projections at his desk. Evenings were for walking home through the lengthening twilight, the mud finally hardening into manageable paths, the air soft on his face. One such evening, as he passed the tavern, He heard a burst of laughter and song from within. It was a familiar drinking song, bawdy and robust. He paused for a moment, listening. He was not a tavern-goer himself. He preferred the quiet of his own hearth. But the sound spoke of a community shaking off its winter hibernation, of warmth that was social rather than merely physical. He smiled faintly and walked on. At home, Hildegard had news. The cobbler from downstairs, his cough finally gone after the long winter, had offered to teach her how to cut simple leather patterns in exchange for her help with his mending. It was a step towards a trade, a small expansion of her world. She spoke of it over a supper of barley stew with more animation than she had shown in months. Gottfried listened, nodding. It was a good thing. The world was opening up, for her, as for the land. After supper, he stepped into their small yard. The air was cool and sweet. In the strip of sky between the rooftops, a few early stars glimmered. From the direction of the river, he heard the first, tentative chorus of frogs from the thawed marshes, a rhythmic, creaking chirp that would build into a deafening symphony in the weeks to come. It was the sound of life returning, relentless and abundant. He stood for a long time, listening, watching the stars brighten, feeling the gentle turn of the celestial wheel. His thoughts were not of ledgers or projections, but of the simple, vast fact of the season. The next day was the Feast of the Annunciation. The guest list he had helped compile was now a reality. The town was fuller, noisier. Strange liveries were seen in the streets. The inns were crowded, and the smell of roasting meat from the bishop's kitchens wafted over the wall. Gottfried, from his scriptorium window, watched a party of mounted knights clatter across the courtyard, their armor polished, their voices loud. They were part of a world that was more colorful, more violent, and more fleeting than his own. He watched them pass, a silent observer from his perch in the world of parchment. They did not glance up. Their story was one of tournaments and politics. His was one of grain and ink. Both were necessary, in their way. He felt no envy, only a detached curiosity. Feast day meant a half-holiday. In the afternoon, with the chancery quiet, Gottfried decided to take a walk beyond the town walls. He followed the track that led towards the river, past the now empty, snow-broken stalks of last year's hemp fields. The ground was soft underfoot. Patches of purple crocus and yellow coltsfoot dotted the brown margins of the path. He reached a low rise that looked out over the river valley. The water was high and fast with meltwater, a turbulent, muddy brown, carrying branches and other winter debris. On the far bank, the willows were tinged with the faintest haze of green, a color so subtle it was more a feeling than a sight. He sat on a fallen log, his back to the town. For perhaps an hour, he did nothing. He watched the river flow. He watched a hawk circling high on a thermal. He listened to the water's roar, the wind in the bare trees, the distant, lonely cry of a curlew. His mind, so often focused on a square foot of vellum, was allowed to expand to the horizon. It held nothing, no calculations, no lists, no problems to solve. It was a perfect, empty vessel, filled only with the sensory present. He thought, then, of the completed northern roll, asleep in its archive. He thought of the grain in the granary at Oberstein, some of it now being weighed out as seed for the New Year's hope. He thought of Caspar the beekeeper, who might now work off his debt in the spring woods. He thought of the numbers on his projection sheets, which were not yet reality, but a plan for it. All of it, the record, the resource, the debt, the plan, was connected in a vast, slow, mostly invisible system. He was a tiny part of that system, a cog that turned by checking sums and making notes. It was a humble role, but he saw, with a clarity afforded by the river air and the wide sky, that it was an essential one. Without the record, there was no memory. Without the plan, there was no direction. Without the careful, boring work of clerks, the world of knights and bishops, of farmers and bees, would descend into a chaos of forgotten obligations and mismanaged plenty. The insight was not dramatic. It did not fill him with a sense of destiny. It simply was, as solid and true as the log on which he sat. He was content. As the sun began to dip towards the wooded hills, he stood, brushed the bark from his clothes, and walked back to Sankt Wendel. The town awaited him, with its smells and sounds, its small duties and quiet hearth. He re-entered through the gate as the first lights were being lit in the windows. The world of administration, of ink and vellum, of gentle, endless history, welcomed him back. And so, my dear, patient listener, we must leave him there, not at an end, for there is no end to such a story, only a pause. Gottfried will return to his desk tomorrow. He will finish the seed projections. He will likely be assigned to audit the candle tax from the town's chandlers, or to copy the new market regulations. Reinhard will find a new minor annoyance to dissect, perhaps the squeak of a door hinge, or the inconsistent quality of the new batch of sand for blotting. Hildegard will learn to cut leather. The bishop's guests will depart, leaving behind empty stables and gossip. The river will subside. The seeds will be sown. The bees will emerge from their hives. The wheel will turn. We have dwelt for a long time in the meticulously uneventful world of Sankt Wendel in the year 1374. We have lingered over the price of rye, the problem of a draft, the texture of vellum, the sound of a snowstorm, the slow satisfaction of a completed roll. We have reveled in the profoundly boring, and in doing so I hope we have achieved our original purpose. Your mind, which once buzzed with the urgent ephemera of your own century, has been gently led down a long, quiet corridor, lined with filing cabinets. It has been asked to hold nothing more demanding than the conversion rate for wind measures, or the proper stuffing for a drafty crack. It has been immersed in the deep, warm waters of the mundane, where there are no stakes, no surprises, only the steady, rhythmic pulse of a world going about its business, one small, manageable task at a time. This immersion is the true sleep story. It is not a narrative that forces your mind to follow a plot, to care about characters, to anticipate a climax. It is an environment into which your mind can simply dissolve. The details are so specific, yet so unimportant, that they become a kind of white noise. A rich, textured, historical white noise that crowds out the chatter of your own concern. Gottfried's minor triumphs and tiny vexations are not yours. His world is not yours, and that's the point. In its serene, distant foreignness, it provides the perfect escape. You can visit, you can observe, but you have no responsibility there, no decisions to make, no emails to answer, no meetings to attend, only the slow, sure knowledge that somewhere, in the archives of history, a clerk is sanding a parchment, a guard is watching over grain, and the seasons are changing with a majestic, predictable slowness. So as you lie there in the dark of your own time, let the last images of this boring history settle over you like a second blanket. See the faint glow of the tallow dip on the oak desk. Hear the soft dry shush of the pumice stone on the vellum skin. Smell the mingled scents of ink, dust, and the damp spring air. Feel the solid, unremarkable weight of a life lived in service to order, to record, to the quiet perpetuation of things. This story has been a long, slow exhalation, a release. It has been the literary equivalent of watching moss grow on a north-facing stone, or counting the bricks in a very old, very long wall. Its value lies not in what happened, but in what did not happen. No one was saved. No great truth was revealed. No heart was broken or mended. There was only the work, the weather, and the turning of the page. And now, the page turns to a blank one. The story is over, because we have stopped telling it. But the world it describes goes on, in the endless, looping scroll of time. Gottfried will pick up his quill tomorrow, but you can finally lay down the burden of attention. You have accompanied him through audit and storm, through calculation and quiet. Your vigil is done. Let the images blur. Let the sounds fade. Let the meticulous, boring, beautiful history of a nothing special place in a long ago year recede into the soft darkness from which it came. It has served its purpose. It has been a door, and on the other side of that door is a deep, untroubled silence. Close the ledger. Blow out the candle. Feel the cool, smooth parchment of sleep roll out before you, blank and ready. The only calculation left is the slow, steady subtraction of wakefulness, the gentle sum of breath and stillness. The archives of the night are open. Go now and rest. There is nothing more to record.